Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gerhard Marchl. On behalf of the Karl-Renner-Institute, a warm welcome. Quite a small audience. Many thanks for coming anyway. A warm welcome also to the panelists. Thank you for being here. From Ukraine, from Austria, of course. Many thanks. You might have noticed, many of you are the first time here. The Renner Institute has moved to new premises. It was about 3 months ago that we moved to here. So a warm welcome to our new office building, which is not always easy to find. But
maybe the rest of the audience is in Klausenplatz as well.
Maybe, yes, maybe, yeah. Can happen. Yes. We're dealing with elections in Ukraine tonight, and there's a wide range of issues, a wide range of questions. They are linked to these elections. On next Sunday, on forthcoming Sunday, there's the first round of the presidential elections, and we'll see later, we'll hear later, which are the recent polls. It's very interesting. There's no real favorite for the moment. Other questions we want to discuss tonight are linked to the balance of incumbent President Poroshenko. What's the economic situation in the country? What's the human rights situation in Ukraine? What are the approaches of the candidates, of the many candidates, to resolve the internal and external conflicts? Which role does Russia play officially and unofficially? Other candidates pushed by Moscow? And what will be the impact of the elections on the conflict in Donbass? In this context, we have to be aware of the fact that each and every week there are still fatalities, casualties in the Donbass region along that contact line. Each and every week, soldiers and civilians are killed. So many questions we were going to deal with tonight. Before opening up and giving the floor to the moderator, Jutta SOMMERBAUER, I'd like to say thank you to our cooperation partners. As always, this discussion is always the result of joint initiatives. So many thanks to the International Institute for Peace and its president Hannes SWOBODA and director Stefan Fenkert. Many thanks to the Center for Eurasian Studies at the University of Vienna and its coordinator Alexander DUBOWY. And last but not least, many thanks to the Competence Centre for Black Sea region at the University of Applied Sciences, BFI, in Vienna, and its head, Johannes LEITNER. Many thanks for the good cooperation. Many thanks also to Jutta SOMMERBAUER, who will be moderating tonight's event. Jutta SOMMERBAUER is a correspondent in Moscow for the Presse, for the newspaper, the Presse, and she's a real expert on Ukraine too. She published 2 books in the last 3 years on Ukraine. About 1 year ago, your recent book was published. I quote the title in German, Grauzone, eine Reise zwischen den Fronten im Donbass. So we are also glad that you accepted to moderate this discussion, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gerhard Marchl, for the introduction, and good evening also to you from my side. I have to say that although I'm based in Moscow, mostly covering Russian politics, I'm pleased every time that I can go to Ukraine and cover Ukrainian politics because it's so much more lively and kind of, sometimes entertaining. Election, as there are many of you in the audience, I guess, who are regular Ukraine watchers like myself, and so you're aware of the fact that election campaigns in Ukraine are usually, as I said, very lively, loud, pluralistic, competitive, and at times heated.
Not like in Russia.
Not like in Russia, exactly, yeah. You know what I was going to say.
Sorry.
And the outcome is very often unpredictable. Yet there is something especially intriguing about the decision on Sunday. For the first time probably in the history of independent Ukraine, even the names of the candidates who will make it to the runoff are not known ahead of time. So even experts in Ukraine find it hard to make a forecast. I was in Kiev last week and talked to different sociologists, and actually nobody could tell me for sure who will be the two politicians the two candidates that will make it into the runoff, which is most likely going to take place on 21st of April. So on Sunday is the first round, and 21st of April we're expecting the second round of the elections. There are 39 candidates left now, which is a lot also for Ukraine. But tonight we will focus mainly on the first three ones that have the highest ratings. This is ex-Prime Minister Julija Tymoschenko, who comes at the moment third in most opinion polls. There is a new opinion poll that was issued yesterday by Razumkov Centre in Kiev, which is a very renowned independent think tank and sociological research institute. And there she gets nearly 15%. Then there's the incumbent President Petro Poroshenko, who is now second in most of the surveys. Razumkov, according to the Razumkov survey, he gets 22%. And telling from this, it seems possible that he will make it to the runoff. But just remember 2014, when he was a first-time candidate, he actually won in the first round. So that's quite a difference. And you see how the mood and how the situation in the country has changed. Again, he won against Julija Tymoschenko back then, just to remind you. So both Tymoschenko and Poroshenko, they will need high voter turnout to perform well. And as in many other European countries, also in Ukraine, for many voters it will be a last-minute decision whether they will take part, and of course also for whom they will vote. And as in the weeks before, comedian Volodymyr Zelenskiy is the front runner in all polls. In the Razumkov poll, he gains nearly 25% of the vote. It's quite interesting to look at his support base. While Tymoschenko and Poroshenko, they have a quite balanced support throughout the country. Zelensky is strongest in the south. He has a lot of supporters in the south. Maybe no coincidence, he comes from the south, or from a southern city of Kryvyi Rih, which is south of Dnipro in central Ukraine. And I think we will also discuss this, who are Zelensky's supporters. Also, it remains to be seen, of course, if all the young fans, the young Zelensky fans, decide to show up on election day. This is yet another kind of open question. And if they will really cast their ballot for this candidate. Zelensky is a new face, of course. He has vowed to fight corruption and turn Ukraine into a state that will serve its citizens. Like the character he represents in his famous TV series Sluga Naroda, which is can be translated as servant of the people, Diener des Volkes. And yet another open question is, of course, will he be the new kind of politician he pretends to be? Zelensky, as Mr. MARCHL already said, is not the only topic tonight. We will also try to conclude on the Poroshenko presidency, on the last 5 years, and also on the reform process, and we'll try to ask how profound it was and how sustainable the changes are. And I will now proceed to the introduction of the panelists. And I would like to start from left. There we have Alena LUNYOVA. She was born in Crimea and worked there as a human rights defender until March 2014. She left the peninsula after the Russian annexation and is now an expert at the Human Rights Center ZMINA, which means change, in Kiev. Her specialization is the protection of the human rights of those who have been affected by the armed conflict in the east of Ukraine. Welcome to Vienna.
Thank you.
Next to her is NADIIA KOVAL. She studied political science in Kiev and in Warsaw. She's a member of the board of the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism in Kiev, where she's the head of the program for Central and Western European Studies. But she will comment on Ukraine tonight, of course. Welcome. Then we have JOHANNES LEITNER. He's the head of the Competence Centre for the Black Sea Region Studies at the University of Applied Sciences, BFE, in Vienna. He was involved in a number of research projects focusing on business environment and political risk factors in Ukraine and Russia, and he also took data right at the spot. And currently he's editing a volume entitled Reconsidering Political Risk in an Era of New Political, Social, Economic and Technological Realities. Wow, what a title.
Yeah,
welcome.
It took quite long to come up with this title, but at least this is already checked.
That's good. Great. I'd like to welcome also Hannes SWOBODA here. He is the president of the International Institute for Peace, based in Vienna. From 1996 to 2014, he was a member of the European Parliament, and from 2012 until June 2014, he also served as the president of the group of Socialists and Democrats in the EP. Welcome. And last but not least, Alexander DUBOWY. He is the coordinator of the Center for Eurasian Studies at the University of Vienna, as well as it was said before. And he's also senior researcher at the Austrian National Defense Academy.
Amen.
Correct?
Correct.
Great. All right. So what I've actually asked the participants to do is to present short introductory statements. And actually, I'd like to begin also with our guests from Ukraine, because you kind of give us the Ukrainian, the domestic perspective. So NADIIA KOVAL, if you could tell us a little bit more about the campaign that is now taking place in Ukraine. What is the atmosphere of this presidential election campaign? What kind of campaign is this, and what are the main topics actually?
Well, I must say, when we talk about not only presidential campaign, The thing is that the first round of presidential election we are facing this Sunday is only a start of a very long election period of Ukraine. So first we have presidential elections, and in October we have parliamentary elections. And as Ukraine is parliamentary presidential republic, and as we see now, we don't know who will become the president. We have different political parties present. The question is not only who will become president on, say, on April 21st and later, but also how will he live together with the old parliament and old government, and what will be the configuration of the parliament in autumn. So this is the whole year of election, which is conceived in Ukraine as very crucial. The stakes are very high. This election is believed to be a certain milestone in Ukraine's development, which will show which direction will Ukraine go afterwards. So the stakes are incredibly high. The campaign is very intense. There has been a lot of scandals. There has been a lot of, as we call it, compromise. The quite intense fight. Candidates often personally attack each other. So the campaign is very difficult. The atmosphere is tense, and as we mentioned a few times already, we do not have reliable sociological data. JUTTA cited at the poll by Razumkov Center. We have another few well-reputed centers. Each of them present different figures. The only thing which is in common between all these polls is that Zelensky surely goes to the second round, but will he go with Tymoschenko or Poroshenko? We have very different figures about that. Partly this is because the polling itself in Ukraine is sometimes not methodologically super correct. People do not reach like to distant villages and stuff. Partly this is because the stakes are high, and sometimes polls are made to influence the outcome of the election and not only to reflect what really people think. So this is about the general atmosphere. If we talk about what are the main questions that actually occupy people, the main trend of this election, which indeed many analysts admit, is this. This is probably the very first election in Ukraine where we don't have this choice in foreign policy. So we have some pro-Russian candidate and pro-European candidates. All three candidates on the top are pro-European, or at least declare themselves. Why is it so? Because on the level of public polls, a majority of Ukrainians declare themselves that they are for the European choice, and even they are for pro-NATO choice. Of course, this is nuanced because this support varies. It can be 80% in the west in the country, it can be 30% in the far east of the country, but in general, it's more than half of population. That's why all the candidates in their programs underline that they support the European and Atlantic choice of the Ukraine, but with different hints. We have President Poroshenko, who actually has the most radical stance. He basically says, as a president, I got for us association agreement, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, liberalized visa regime, and now I promise that by 2023 I will apply for the membership of EU and for the membership action plan for NATO. This is like, to say it mildly, this is a very ambitious plan, but this is his strategy actually for the campaign. On the contrary, Tymoschenko and Zelensky have a little bit vague relations. So they tell that generally they are totally for both, but they do not give the details. And this is always the question, what would they really do in reality? Because, for example, Tymoschenko is the candidate who often attacks the reforms in Ukraine, which are demanded, for example, by some donors, like the reform of the gas sector. Tymoschenko tells in her programs she becomes the president in the first 3 months, in the first months of her presidency. the prices for gas for population go down threefold. This is very popular about people because the reform has increased those prices for the population very importantly. But still, if she does it, then we have some problems with our loans and stuff. Then we have, of course, the question of Russia and the question of war. When we look again at the opinion polls, we see a very interesting situation. Most of the Ukrainian population thinks that what is going in Crimea, in Donbass, in the Azov Sea is actually the war with Russia. At the same time, 70% of people tell that we should finish this war because, we need peace, and we should get some compromises to finish it. Still, only 16% tell that we should go to any compromises to finish it. What is the result? The result is that all the key candidates, they have very, very vague programs of what should they do actually with the conflict, with Russia, with everything. And while Poroshenko always underlines this, he is for Minsk agreements, both Tymoschenko and Zelensky hint that probably we should look for some other solutions. Tymoschenko has in her mind some ideas that we need a new format. She calls it Budapest Plus. So we should come back to the idea of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, after which Ukraine rejected his nuclear weapons, gather the countries who signed it and supported it, so we just add to the negotiating format, I don't know, France, China, United States actually, but she doesn't give any details. So the problem with this solution, let's say so, it doesn't give any details. We don't understand how this format will gonna work because it hasn't worked so far. Very similar situation is for Zelensky. Only Zelensky says that he would also make some personal approach. He said, I will go to Mr. Putin. We should sit together. We should look each other in the eye and find some middle ground. So this is his method. And the final, because I want to finish in 5 minutes, is the question of reforms. And the question of reforms is very difficult for 5 minutes. I
think we'll tackle this in the next question. In the next
yes,
round.
but I just say two words because this is very important question that it actually makes the key difference among three candidates about how they make their campaign, and because normally, again, almost 70% of Ukrainians think that everything goes in the wrong direction. And there is huge disappointment with the elites, and this is a huge breeding ground for populism, only that different candidates give different answers to this problem. For example, if Tymoschenko gives a lot of promises, what she will do for the average Ukrainian if she becomes president. And again, every candidate has in mind not only presidential elections, but also parliamentary. So their solutions go beyond of what president actually can do. So Tymoschenko promises pensions, high salaries, low gas prices, and new medical system and stuff. On the other hand, Zelensky doesn't promise almost anything. He almost really relies on his media image. We've already mentioned his movie, The Servant of the People, and the image he produces there is a representative of the people, a simple teacher who is very honest, who is very anti-corruption, who accidentally becomes president and a very good president. And so this is the image he projects, and he successfully presents him as such a person. And this is another type of populism, very, very new for Ukraine, a populism of the image. And I'll probably stop here and let my colleagues speak.
Thank you, Nadia. I think you did very well. Everything in a nutshell. So we are now really well informed, have a great base, I think. Alena, you're a human rights activist based in Kiev. I'd like to go back with you to the year 2014. when improving freedom of speech was actually one of the biggest or most important demands of the Maidan movement. Now, 5 years later, Ukraine is still has still an unresolved conflict on its territory, is in a state of war, and it has been difficult to protect civil liberties. Now, I'd like to ask you, from your perspective as a civil society activist, 5 years later, where are we standing in terms of protection, freedom of speech in particular?
Thank you for your question. I believe we are standing in front of other challenges, because in 2014 we have challenge of the power of the authorities and authoritarian regime, and now we have another challenge of the war, of the security reason, of the censorship, and this other type of challenges which we need to combine with and we need to struggle with. And I do not even won't try to cover all issues which connected to exercising of the right of freedom of speech or freedom of media, but I want to highlight several issues which I thought that we need to discuss here, because sometimes the freedom of speech is restricted in order to security reasons, in which actually we do not need to restrict the human rights and the freedom of speech. But sometimes we have legal ground to restriction, unfortunately, because of front line, because of the closer to contact line. And I want, the first trend, what I want to highlight, it's censorship. And I know that most of international colleagues said that censorship is a problem for Ukraine, and Ukrainian journalists said that it's the really case. But despite of the fact that we have an ongoing conflict in Ukraine, but most journalists said that the conflict is not the reason of censorship, but the ownership or owner's position, but the owner of the channel, of the media position in some questions is the reasonable or the reason of censorship in the media. And we now in the middle of election process, we understood how it works, because we know that the most people in Ukraine, the 40% of Ukraine rely on the information from the TV channels. And who is the owner of TV channels? Those persons are owner of the mind of the people. So 1+1 channel and Zelensky, 5th channel and Poroshenko and Prism and Poroshenko. So basically, people who are in the top 3 have access or free access to the TV channels. And sometimes on these channels, the owners or editorial politics provide some censorship for some topics. Another issue that self-censorship for some topics in which journalists feel that those topics are too controversial for our society. And according to focus group discussions, such topics we can include in this list of topics. LGBT issues, still we have those issues. The crime which conducted by Ukrainian army on the east of Ukraine, and when they came back home, critical of the church, and several other issues. So basically, sometimes journalists conduct this self-censorship because of the topic. And third, what I want to say about censorship, it's the interference of Ukrainian authorities. Because sometimes, in order to fight with Russian propaganda, Ukrainian authority try to interfere in the channel politics, the journalist works, sometimes through the interference on the owners of the channels, and sometimes through the, for example, travel bans for international journalists who haven't possibility to come in Ukraine anymore, or during some times, because of some probable violations of Ukrainian law. But for example, yesterday, State Immigration Service announced that Russian journalist who stayed in Ukrainian for some time, she will be dismissed from the Ukraine because of her propaganda role and spread of the stems of Kremlin propaganda in Ukraine. So directly, the content which produced by the journalist became the reason why she will be deported from the Ukraine. And this is kind of censorship in the war, and this is challenge we faced in. Second stuff which I need to highlight in this issue, this physical integrity of journalists and this physical attacks for journalists in Ukraine and lack of investigation of this attack. When we speak about numbers, so in 2018, the number of violation of freedom of speech in Ukraine is about 235, which was reported by the Ukrainian NGOs. And 173 violations, it's about attack on journalists. So basically, journalists in Ukraine are not in safe because of their position, anti-corruption work, because of their work, actually. And usually, we don't have transparent investigation of these attacks. And that can lead to the cooling effect. And journalists try to not criticize authority anymore or be more polite because it takes risk to be a journalist. And third stuff, this is pressure, parliamentary pressure, which we faced for 5 years ago and now we face again. Because during 2018 and beginning of 19, we received several draft laws which are against freedom of speech in Ukraine. The last one was about criminal responsibility for dissemination of inaccurate information. So basically, if unpredictably or without any intention, the mass media just will spread the information which will be inaccurate, according to MPs, the idea of MPs, he or she, the journalist, should face the criminal responsibility. And this is quite tricky issues because during 2018, the Coalition for the Free Internet, the coalition of NGOs who support the idea of internet, free access to internet without any restriction, conduct more than dozens actual statements against draft laws which have been registered in the parliament. So basically, these three trends is new one. Something is a new changes, just new phase of the old challenge. But we need to say that according to previous speaker, we have several issues with the reform, and in the middle of the reform or some reform is not very successful. But we do not build the institution to protect people and freedom of speech of Ukrainians and of journalists. And that's why we do not have any trust to system which is actually now we have. I want to say something again, but okay.
Let's stop here.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for updating us on this important topic, and also for pointing out some problems and challenges in the area of freedom of speech. I think we will come back again to the topic and maybe discuss also the working conditions for journalists in greater detail. I'd like to ask Johannes now. You're an expert in assessing risk factors in post-socialist transition countries. How does the international business community look at Ukraine and at the elections in Ukraine? Is there a, favorite candidate? And what will be important for investors after this election marathon?
Okay, thank you very much for these questions. I'll try to keep myself brief, at least at the first stage. Now, what I want to start with is that because very often when we talk about Ukraine in the framework of business environment, corruption, Ukraine is always the black sheep. It's very often portrayed as a very, very problematic place for doing business. And a little bit in order to counteract this picture, I also would like to highlight what has happened over the last 5-6 years in the country, because I think that considering like the very challenging circumstances with the annexation of Crimea, with the conflict in eastern Ukraine, Ukraine, also with the help of international donors and international institutions, managed quite well to overcome first the recession. Like the recent and latest indicators, economic indicators, are not so bad actually, considering again these circumstances. Secondly, also Ukraine managed quite well to overcome a huge financial crisis and achieved in stabilizing the financial systems. Also, again, certainly through the help of and through the assistance of the International Monetary Funds and so forth. But still, I think these are very important aspects also when taking a look at the country. Also, Ukraine recently again achieved in attracting very international or very important international investors such as IKEA, H&M, and also Ryanair. Why is it important? It's not only important when you take a look at the competitive situation, but these are also signs to the population that there is something moving into a positive direction. So if you have IKEA in the country who already tried for the last 20 years to get a foothold in the country and always did not achieve, it now really made this step and just very recently opened the first store, which also breaks up some of the local monopolies. We also saw it with Ryanair. I mean, we can certainly very much discuss about the practices of Ryanair, but still, I mean, it achieved in lowering overall ticket prices in Ukraine. So these are very, I would say, positive signs. On the other hand, also Ukraine introduced the e-procurement system Prozoro, which also already after first evaluation, since it's in full effect, showed that the number of companies that achieved in contracting with public agencies was multiplied. So it's not always the same companies that take advantage of public tenders, but it's really spreading. So these are, I would say, very positive signs. On the other hand, of course, when we take a closer look into the country, there is still a lot of problems that need to be overcome. And also here, IKEA is a very interesting example, because on the one hand, I think it's a good sign that they entered the country, but on the other hand, it was just because, I mean, not only just because, but one of the important concessions that Ukraine made to IKEA was to establish a special body, a special supervising body that would really take care and guarantee that all the customs regulations, transport, shipping, supply chains would be guaranteed without any, let's say, problems, so that IKEA is really guaranteed a smooth transport of its supplies and so forth, which also shows that the country is achieving, but still the policymakers are aware of the fact that it's not like a routine positive situation, but they try to really take care of some very special investors. So for instance, if I would be a small, medium-sized Vienna-based company, I probably wouldn't get these privileges and this special protection. So there still might be some problems. Yeah, and this brings me back to the main problem when characterizing the Ukrainian also system, which we would refer to as a state capture system, which means there is a quite small number of elite representatives who concentrate a very high degree of economic and political power, and they would even abuse public institutions for their own private gains. And this is the major problem, because in spite of all the achievements that have been made in anti-corruption fightings, I mean, the center problem is still that the judiciary is yet works as the way it has always worked. And you already described the major problems. So there is, whenever you might have problems with public authorities, and you take it to the courts, it would be a guessing game whether actually depending on who you are fighting against. But still, it would be a very biased game that you play. And when coming back to the elections, I think one of the major expectations and problems is that when we take a look at the candidates, basically those who are really attributed any realistic chances of winning the final presidential votes, they are all part of the system. And whatever fightings and achievements we observed so far in order to fight corruption it's always only to the degree the oligarchs actually wanted to have it or can control it. So and this is probably the problem that will remain.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. Mr. SWOBODA, how does Europe look at the Ukrainian elections, and is there an ideal candidate for Eurocrats? I mean, diplomats have shared this view with me. They told me that they would rather stick to Petro Poroshenko because at least we know him and we know what to expect. Is this also your feeling?
Well, it depends, of course, on what is Europe. We have to define, and then we could define what is Ukraine, and then we could speak about it. But we'll come back to that immediately. We start perhaps with my personal context, because they show the difficulty Europe has. When I was still vice president of the Socialists and Democrats, we were approached by Mr. Poroshenko, by Mr. Yanukovych also personally, and Mr. Azarov and others, who was the prime minister and then party leader. Yeah, the party of the region wants to become social democrats, so we should help them with an agreement, a working agreement. But they were not interested they were interested in a name, but not in changing anything. So I stopped the agreement when I became president of the group. Then, about the same time, we were approached by Tymoschenko, and she wants to join the social democratic family. And I said, okay, what are your values, your interest? There was nothing really coming out. Of course, the European Parliament was very helpful in supporting her when she was in prison and so on. Of course, she has some ideas, and even now from the Vienna Institute for International Economics, we did some work for her, because I'm not so sure that IMF measures are always the best measures, and therefore I think she is right in some of the elements. But if she would do all she is proposing, it would be chaos. So either she does what she does, or she would do what she promises, or she would keep none of the promises, which probably would be more the reality. And Poroshenko is the same, and we had a lot of hope, and I had many contacts also with him, but at the end of the day, it's not really visible an interest of changing the society. Now, of course, it is true what just has been said about the economy. We have in more and more countries, look, Hungary and some other countries, where you don't have a real liberal political system, but you have a relatively open economy, even with some oligarchs, who are closely connected with the power, but they leave, of course, open room for foreign investors who could come and could flourish. So I think it's not, democracy is preparing everything for a good economy and then everything goes well. No, you have different kind of combinations of oligarchic rule in a general democratic framework with many violations also of human rights. And at the same time, you have some new investors coming. Ukraine is a big market. It's not, not some small negligible market. And you have very good young people, especially in the internet and digital economy. So we have excellent people. Also, as the Austrian government is so clever not to give enough money for the education of IT and other people, investors go or even Austrian companies go to Ukraine and ask for services in the IT sector. Okay, it's a support for Ukraine. Maybe it is intentionally done by the government. So what I see is a very complex picture with some many black spots, with some white spots, some reforms which have been done, but no thorough change. And if you see that, and there is no other candidate who gives you the vision of a drastic change, and there is a candidate who is an ex-comedian who is quite funny, but at the end of the day you don't know who are behind him, what are the kind of relations.
Actually, we do know who's behind him.
Yeah, of course, we know, but we don't know exactly how far and how much and how are the financial streams and many other things. So you say, okay, what we know more or less is Mr. Poroshenko. And what is also important is that we won't have to change our policy towards Russia. Because Poroshenko, of course, he seems to have many telephone calls also with Mr. Putin, many contacts, and they agree about, probably which is the room of maneuver for the one or the other. So I think that's the guess, also from my side, that most Europeans would say we are not happy with him, so let's stick to him. What is, as far as I see,
not happy, but let's stick to him.
To him, yeah.
Okay.
But what I see would be an alternative, without saying for the presidential way, is, as far as I know the statistics, maybe I'm wrong, that there's a big trust of society, not for the politicians, but for the civil society in Ukraine. And therefore the cooperation with the civil society, also on the questions you raised about human rights and other issues, should be much stronger if there would be a clever diplomacy, because we cannot choose the president, but we can maybe go in the direction of having some changes in that direction. Of course, at the end of the day, we will see also what the US is doing. If Mr. Trump is so clever after the Golan Heights to say, well, the other occupied areas, why not recognize them and go for the Crimea, which would be a stringent line for Mr. Trump. So that would be more problems for the European position than maybe the question who is the president for the moment. But pragmatically, yes, Poroshenko would be the best solution. If the best for the country, I don't know. The country has to decide. But I think, is it good for any solution of the big problem in the Donbass and the Crimea? No, but on the other hand, for the moment, I don't see any possibility to come to terms with Russia. Even looking into the eyes will not change Putin. You have the example of Georgia, where you have also thought, okay, the Georgian dream when he comes to power, with a more soft line would get a solution in their area. I don't know. The real change will come not in Ukraine. The real change would come in Moscow. And in some years' time, maybe Mr. Putin is leaving the field. Maybe then there's a new possibility. But for the moment, I think status quo is what is on the agenda.
Thanks a lot. Actually, you've summed up everything.
No.
But still, I'd like to ask Alexander DUBOWY. Mr. SWOBODA already mentioned there must have been a lot of phone calls between Putin and Poroshenko, but apparently they don't get along too well, the two presidents. So does Moscow have a favorite candidate?
Thank you. I will just add 2 or 3 points. First of all, the personality of the newly elected president, whoever he or she will be, will not dramatically affect or influence the Russian-Ukrainian relationship. If talking about Russian expectations, so first of all, I do think that Russia does have quite low expectations, or very low. Russian position is can be described as a wait-and-see position. For now, Russia doesn't seem to have neither the resources or the political will to influence the elections. And but I still think that in Russia there's hope for a double shift in politics. For double shift in Ukraine, the first shift is a rhetorical shift, and the second shift is a real policy shift, especially in the economic area. So a shift from radical and confrontational rhetorics policy towards a more constructive approach. First and foremost in the economic sphere. If talking about a Russian favorite candidate, so I would say Yuri Boyko. The first glance from the opposition bloc, but Russia is a realistic power, and they do know that he enjoys very little public support. Because of that, Moscow will talk and negotiate with any candidates who will win the elections. If talking about Julija Tymoschenko, the positive thing about Julija Tymoschenko for Russia, she's quite predictable. She's quite predictable. She's ready to talk with Putin, but the negative thing is just the same. She's only quite predictable, not very much. If talking about Zelensky, he promised to negotiate, but Zelensky is absolutely unpredictable from the Russian point of view. Just can't say what he will do or how he will affect the politics. If talking about Poroshenko, it's quite interesting in this case. On the one hand, Poroshenko is actually very problematic for Russia because he relies on this narrative of Russia being an external threat for Ukraine. He was recently talking about 2 problems which Ukrainian state has for the time being. The first problem is poverty, the second problem is Russia. So that's the negative thing about him from Russian point of view. And the second negative thing, Poroshenko is influenced from the United States and to some extent from the European Union. So talking with Poroshenko, if talking with Poroshenko, you will need a Western will to influence him, so you will talk with Russia. But on the positive side, as Mr. SWOBODA has already mentioned, Poroshenko is very predictable, and Russia loves predictable politicians. And yet, we should also take into consideration the mid-strategic sphere, if you like to. Russian-Ukrainian relations are embedded into a wider regional and international context. So just keep this in mind. And as Andrei Kortunov from Russian International Affairs Council mentioned recently, the Ukrainian problem can be only solved if the problem between the EU and Russia will be solved. So.
Thanks a lot. I think we will stay at the topic of Zelensky a little bit longer because, as I said, and I mean many of you referred to him also in your statements. We know not a lot about him. We know his kind of media personality. Nadia, I'd like to ask you again. You were already going to comment on that. What is behind Zelensky? Which maybe also power structure is behind Zelensky? And another important issue, I think. Can he be a reformer? Could he probably be a reformer? What do you think?
I think this meteoric rise of Zelensky in the last 3 months as key presidential candidate, it reflects all the contradictions that Ukraine has gone through in these 5 years. And Mr. SWOBODA has spoken about the civil society that could be a kind of a solution, yes, to this lack of candidate that would be good for everyone, that would not be like, okay, it's just acceptable. But there is a problem with Ukrainian civil society because it's very fractured. We have a kind of elite of civil society, a great number of activists who are in coalitions, who are pushing for reform, who are doing advocacy, both in Ukraine and abroad. We can always meet them and listen to them. And these civic activists, they mostly speak that we are very, very feeble of reform. We need much more reform. The reform is stumbling. And generally the discourse is that we have too little of reform. We should have done much more. Like, for example, in the pre-election and election year, we still, anti-corruption reform is inconclusive. Judiciary reform is a long way to go. The privatization of state enterprises haven't actually started, and so on and so forth. So this is a force that first pushes for more reform, and second pushes for new faces. But the problem is, they didn't manage to produce a new face. So this social strata, they didn't present a viable candidate. So their candidate now polls at 6 to 10%, and he's not really a new face. I speak about fourth candidate, fourth or fifth, according to different polls, former defense minister Anatoly Gritsenko, yes. And in the meantime, there is a larger part of the society which, in a way, stays disconnected from this elite. And this societies think that some reforms that are in place, they have too much a price to pay. Because actually there are a big part of the reforms have been a kind of austerity reforms. So the currency was devalued. When was a huge reform of the banks which helped much to the financial sectors. People lost their bank money. People lost their salaries, became just small. People have got huge payments for gas, for water, for whatnot. And they do not catch this movement. We need more reforms like that. Do we really need, we need more social security? And here, the civil society hasn't responded to that, and populists did. And this is very important for Zelensky, who actually appears in his movie as a good guy from the people who will work for the people. And what is also important for Zelensky is that he managed to take a big part of the electorate from the south. Because the party of the region is now defunct. It actually split into two factions. It presents two presidential candidates. Boyko, who was mentioned, doesn't take more than 10% anyway. He has another guy, Wilkul, supported by another oligarch. In this case, Zelensky is very, very good candidate for the South because he originates from the region. He is a Russian speaker. He is a successful figure. He is a guy from the people who made himself, who got to the capital. And this is not an old Soviet director of some red director of some plant in the south who has had this semi-feudal power over the region. This is someone new and fresh, and this helps him very much. And this is very likable image. And for example, before Zelensky, we also had a big populist in Ukrainian politics called Oleg Lyashko. I don't know if he is familiar to the wider audience, but he exploited other image. He was like this coarse guy from the village, who he made photos with cows. He was like trying to, he's so proximate to the very, very simple people, to the villagers. And he was successful for some time, but now people want somebody else. And Lyashko went very much down in the polls, and Zelensky went up. And also this question of the support by Kolomoisky. Of course, in these 5 years, the general system of the oligarchic clans, it did not disappear. But it changed a bit. All the oligarchs in Ukraine became poorer, and some, like Kolomoisky,
Relatively poor.
Relatively, yes. But the balance of power changed about them. Firtash is in Austria, Kolomoisky is in Israel. He lost his biggest asset, the private bank, and he seeks revenge. And he supported more or less Tymoschenko, but then he saw this potential in Zelensky, and he supported him a bit through his TV channel, because his TV channel 1+1 is the channel where Zelensky has the most exposure. And for example, on Saturday, the day before the election, where this is like day of quiet in Ukraine, you can't do agitation. We have all programmed by Zelensky and movies and everything. So, and it's
legal.
Yes, it's barely legal. And here we see this desire of revenge, but again, a question. If we get Tymoshenko and Zelensky in the second round, whom will Kolomoisky support? Because Zelensky is very unpredictable for him. He is not like, you can't say that Zelensky is a puppet of Kolomoisky. The more support he gets some people into his team, other people approach him, try to establish connections, try to influence his illusions, and who knows what will happen. So in a nutshell, this was the phenomenon which was very difficult to predict, but once we have it, we can very easily explain it.
All right. Thanks a lot. Alyona, I'd like to ask you one thing, and maybe this is more a question to you as a citizen of Ukraine, actually. I mean, we talk about Zelensky, and I noticed that he actually addresses the public in Russian. He also answers interviews. He gives interviews in Russian. How does this appear, or what is the reaction of the Ukrainian public to this? I'd just be really curious. We know that in the past years there has been this kind of intense language politics, the kind of priority given to the development of the Ukrainian language also in the public sphere. What is this candidate Zelensky like, who is like this Russian speaker?
I shouldn't address this question because I'm really not consumer. I'm not a consumer of TV channels and the candidate Zelensky. So basically, I believe the language issue is the issue for division of Ukrainian society, and this is something which we shouldn't touch before the election and after also. But now in the parliament, there is a hearing of the law about the language. Actually, it's a controversial law. So basically, I believe that from the perspective of so-called patriotic powers, and we have enough of those. Russian speaker candidates who have told about his readiness for negotiations with Vladimir Putin is the traitor, is a person who shouldn't be the head of the state, shouldn't be the head of the army actually. And the Poroshenko has the opposite motto: army, language, the belief. And I don't really know how this Russian speaker is perceived by the wide audience. Maybe Nadia is know better about that. And she said that she's already said that his Russian speaker, his Russian language is one of the grounds of his support by the South, because on the South and the East there is a long, perspective problem with the Russian language, and this the ground for populistic motto every time before any election last 20 years. Every time they have been promised to have this second language, state language, the Russian language. So basically now we have some trend to forbid the Russian language as the language of cultural products, serious books, and this actually which is human rights violations. And I know that we have several local decision in several regions in which the Russian language is forbidden as a cultural product. So for movies, for example, on the TV. And in those regions, this decision was cancelled by the court. So basically, because of society needs probably to have Russian language in these movies, and also because the human rights defenders said that this is unlawful, actually, decision of local authorities, because local authorities is not in power to decide what the language it should be for the speaking, for the cultural changes, etc. I don't know if I answer for your question, but still.
All right, thank you. We've talked about the candidates so far. We've talked about their financial supporters. Many candidates are, not all of them, but many candidates are backed by oligarchs. Johannes, you also talked about the influential economic kind of power blocks in Ukraine. You even called it state capture, which is really drastic, I believe. Why has it been so difficult to break these blocks and monopolies?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the terminology of state capture, I think it's not rather. I mean, it might sound dramatic, but it's something that actually applies to majority of countries that are not part of the OECD. So I mean, you to different degrees you would observe OECD countries. Yeah, not OSC but OECD. Yeah. So you could observe it in very different places around the world to different degrees. I mean, I think the major problems why it is so hard and probably not impossible, but really very difficult to break these monopolies. That there is first of all, among the ruling elite, who would have a real interest in breaking this, if you would describe it as some kind of a coalition among the ruling elite. So I think most of them, as long as there is no rivalry about resources, this elite would be very well advised. I mean, cynically speaking, well advised not to get into competition with each other. And I think this is what we observed very well in Ukraine over the last years, that there are different markets. They are quite well separated and divided among the different oligarchs. All of them have their stakes in different industries. and they would not necessarily compete with each other in these different industries. So because as long as this system is stabilized, and as long as the resources are still like flowing into their pockets, there would not be a lot of interest in changing the system. And I think the changes that we do see with these anti-corruption mechanisms, I wouldn't only call them cosmetics, but I mean, also, as you said, I mean, it doesn't go into the core where it really would overhaul the system. And we saw, I mean, we see very similar patterns in the post-Soviet era. It's not only in Ukraine, even in Georgia, which was very long seen as a role model in the whole area. We see recently signs of a reshifting into these mechanisms and into these patterns of a captured state, which tries to get rid of competitors that would destabilize and even break up the monopoly rents of the ruling authorities. So, insofar, I think, I mean, that would be the theoretical explanation for it. And I think Alexander also pointed to the fact that Poroshenko, he very much uses this picture and narrative of Russia as the external threat, which we also we did some research in end of 2016, so quite after the where we still had the conflicts in eastern Ukraine and Crimea very freshly also affecting the business in the area. And we wanted to find out what the international business community, what they would refer to as the bigger threats. Would it be these external conflicts with Russia, or would it be like the internal, more or less traditional risks of the corruption systems and state capture and so forth? And surprisingly, we found out that most of the international business representatives, they would refer to the internal threats as the more crucial problems, because they very quickly adjusted to these external threats. So they very quickly shifted their supply chains from Russia to alternative sources. They started to operating their Crimean business from other areas. They sometimes evenly got rid of nasty competitors from eastern Ukraine and focused more in their business, focused more on western Ukraine and gained increasing market shares there because eastern Ukrainian competitors withdrew from the market. So to keep it short, these internal problems were of higher relevance and still are of higher relevance to the business communities as were the external threats, with the only exception like the second order effects of the conflict, which basically resulted in economic recession and depreciation of the hryvnia and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. Maybe one more topic concerning foreign policy as orientation of Ukraine would be the association agreement that also was signed under Poroshenko's presidency. There is also the visa-free agreement that was reached for Ukrainians who can now travel to the EU without visas, which is, of course, a clear plus. I mean, how do you assess the positive effects for Ukraine after the signing of the association agreement?
May I just make a brief remark?
And of course, feel free
I think
to comment
on this, Poroshenko relation to Putin, I really think, I don't want to be cynical, but that Poroshenko is phoning a and says, Vladimir, of course I have to say Russia is the big enemy. You have to understand. And Putin says, yeah, Poro, yes, I understand, but you know, we will have the influence on some channels and say Ukraine is a failed state. You have also to understand. I think they have some agreement in that sense. It's not, you know, that they are enemies. They are enemies, you know, who know very well what they can tell the other and what the other can sustain. And this is, of course, the problem also for the West. You know, what to do with this situation. Maybe one can be happy that the two, you know, complain about and have this kind of consensus. So I don't think that there's a real contradiction. And the second brief remark, I know the civil society is not, is never producing leaders. I don't know many examples, because we met recently the foreign minister of Northern Macedonia. He comes from civil society, but none of the big leaders don't come from there. But a clever leader, and if Zelensky would be clever, and he's not, as you said, a puppet of one of the oligarchs, he could use the civil society and the dialogue with them, and maybe some of the, you know, the more reasonable oligarchs, I don't know, Mr. Pinchuk or others, to find a modus vivendi where you slowly can change. Because I fully agree with Mr. Leitner, oligarchy rule, you cannot change from one day to another. Yes, you can shoot them, or you can just bring them out of the country, but it doesn't really change. Even we saw it when the Soviet Union was founded. It's a difficult process because they have the power, they give jobs, they give money, so it's a very, very difficult. But if at least somebody who is not himself an oligarch and has some distance could come, so Zelensky would be in some way, let's say, a small window of opportunity. If it's used, is another issue. Now to your question, I think, yes, it is helpful. It is helpful in the way that you have a strong reorientation to the European markets. And the question, and this is also the reason why for some time, or most of the time, Yanukovych and his guys were for the association agreement, because they had, Akhmatov and others, they had some oligarchs who were interested in having European markets for the products. And they knew that to reform and modernize their industry, they need other markets than the Russian market. Not that the Russian market is a bad market, but the Russian market is not pushing for reforms and for modernization. And this is happening in Ukraine, and therefore I think that's a positive element. And of course, the question of the visa liberalization always was, we had it with other countries, and it was not very fair to prevent it with Ukraine, and I think it's not a big problem. It could be a big problem if there would be, you know, big demand for new jobs. But anyway, as I said, IT engineers could come to Austria or other countries because we don't form enough and we don't educate enough and train them. So it is overall positive. Again, I think we should not leave out the question of justice reform, civil liberties, because I think the Europe should be stronger. We were already weak on the Russian language, for example, in some of the Baltic countries when there was some push, you know, to restrict that. But I think if we say freedom of expression, if we say liberal development, multi-language countries, we should insist on that and make it very clear that every restriction, even in that very different situation on the war, is not acceptable. Of course, some elements of it, but not as many as they're done. Because I know from discussion when I was still in the parliament with the people, when they always said, yeah, we're in a war situation, we cannot allow this freedom. Anyway, with the you cannot in reality prevent fake news coming from different sides, not only from Russia, but so in that to try to prevent the Russian language is not a sign. Everybody underlines speaking Russian is not a sign to be Russian or pro-Putin. Yeah, in that sense, to forbid it is crazy because you create even more animosities against it. And the same was when there was a discussion about the Hungarian language. Of course, it has not that all importance for the whole country, but for some districts. So I think here Europe should be much stronger in saying, look, we gave you the association agreement, we gave you the freedom of movement, but please, there are limits on restrictions which you always defend with the hint of having a war with Russia.
Thanks a lot. And just one maybe comment. I mean, I wouldn't like to that what we said about the language laws, actually. I mean, these are also, this is quite specific laws. It's not about that Ukraine doesn't want to kind of ban the use of Russian language, right?
No, but I was referring to your examples of some regions who tried
Of ban Russian.
in the culture. But why should you use it? Yeah, because the Russian culture, it would be also a bridge still to Russia. Because Russia is a neighbor, and if some of the regions would say no use Russian in television or other, that would be, I think, totally wrong.
Would you like to comment? I also kind of encourage you to comment each other's comments. Johannes?
Just one point. You're absolutely right. The European Union should insist on strengthening the rule of law in Ukraine and the minority rights. I think that's the most important point. Just these two would be enough.
All right. Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Just. I also want to say something. No. What we also observe is that when we talk about Russia as a neighbor, I mean, it still is there, and also when you take a look at the economic ties. Russia is still the most important trading partner. I mean, of course, it's
not anymore.
Sure. I mean, until 2017.
EU.
EU.
Yeah,
but
states.
if you
But we trade with EU as a bloc. We don't.
Okay.
EU has single trade policy.
You
So
can
that's
compare
why.
Russia with Austria.
Of course, but according to the World Bank data,
Exactly.
Russia is the most
I mean,
important.
if you add up with European, okay, still, I would say, let's put it differently. Russia remains very important, if you like it or not, as a trading partner. Certainly, it's an exchange of mainly of raw material Ukraine is doing a lot in order to reshape its external trading network. But this has also been a major shock after the war, since the war in Ukraine, that for a lot of products that have been produced in the eastern parts, like machinery, they were all designated to the post-Soviet markets, and they wouldn't be very easily be shifted to Western markets because of technical standards, technical differences. So, and here I think there is a reshaping, and also, but this is also something that takes time. It's impossible to redesign your machinery from one day to the other and adapt it to new market demands. So also here, I think, after all, just as Georgia also has to do, if you like it or not, but there are some neighbors you cannot change. You can change your neighborhood. Maybe you can change your neighbors, but not the neighborhood.
It was Russian sanction. It was not the agreement with the EU who prevented to continue trade with Russia. Also, Austria, as a country inside the EU, quite developing trade with Russia. So that was a deliberate sanction by Russia.
Okay. Sure, but there is a lot of rhetoric also how Austria was affected by Russian sanctions, which actually is Austria's economy, it was mainly the dairy products and meat production. I mean, they very quickly shifted. So the actual loss of market for Austria because of the sanctions of Russia was quite small. I know there are some influential Austrian companies that would always press for lifting the sanctions because they say Austria actually had to obtain huge losses because of that, but that's actually minor.
Yeah. Of course, you can export apple to Kazakhstan, and in Kazakhstan, and every citizen eats 10 apple a day because. All of a sudden, the import is rising, but it's going to Russia via Kazakhstan.
Yeah, but interestingly, it was mainly Middle East, North African new markets that were, and East Asian
new
markets.
markets.
Hi, but we don't talk about Austria. Sorry.
I think maybe it's time to yeah.
I'd like also to mention just one or 2 points. Also talking about the Russian interests.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just mention this point very briefly. 4 interests, I would suppose, 4 points. The first one, Crimea is not an issue at all. They're not discussing about giving back Crimea. So Russia is now searching for such a format of a peaceful resolution which would exclude the Crimean question. That's the first one. The second interest, implementation of the Minsk agreements and reintegration of Donbass. It's definitely in Russian interest. We shouldn't forget that the Minsk protocol as well as the Minsk agreement are the result of a military defeat of Ukrainian armed forces. Just never forget this point. If talking about why does Kiev not implement the Minsk agreements, just don't forget, it's a result of a military defeat. Nobody likes it. So the third point, Russia, I would suppose, Russia would like to rebuild its economic relations with Ukraine. Russia is still very strong trade partner number 1, if talking about nation states. I would say also connecting Ukraine in some way with the Eurasian Economic Union. Ukraine should not become a part of it, not anymore, but in some way a cooperation with the Eurasian Economic Union would be definitely in Russian interests. And the fourth point, shouldn't forget the issue of labor migration. The migrants from Ukraine are very important for Russian economy. So that's also a point.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and we have not been talking about Donbass.
No, not yet. But
Okay.
we're going to come back to this. But all the things that you have mentioned, to me, it sounds very much like future talk. I mean, it sounds like Russia is looking for pragmatic areas of cooperation with Ukraine. At the moment, just if you allow me this,
of course.
I cannot see this kind of pragmatic approach from the Kremlin.
Russia is looking for a pragmatic exit strategy from the Donbass conflict.
Mm.
And this exit strategy goes hand in hand with the conflict resolution and also with the pragmatic cooperation with Ukraine. For now, Russia doesn't really know what to do with Ukraine, besides the question of economic ties, strengthening economic ties, pragmatic economic ties, and the question of labor migration. There's still no visa regime between Ukraine and Russia. From the Russian side, just don't forget that.
Okay, but isn't Crimea actually at the heart of the problem? I mean, you can't just kind of single it out.
From our point of view,
I think that's the whole problem. Or
probably, I think if we just mentioned Russian position, we could also mention Ukrainian position. Of course, Ukrainian position is Crimea is still on the table. It's never been off the table, and the current strategy is that we should make Crimea as costly for Russia as possible. So, suing in international courts, drawing attention to anything that happened there, like, I don't know, human rights violations, like yesterday's wonderful searches and arrest of Crimean Tatar activists. Second, as to the Donbass Minsk agreements, yes, fine, but if Russia wants so much Minsk agreement, why doesn't it keep to its part? So it's still fighting, it's still 13,000 deaths. Third, we can talk a lot if President Poroshenko talks most harsh about Russian threat or somebody don't, but still if you don't speak which threat is more important, internal or external, if you speak in the sense of external threats, sorry, Russia is still the most important external threat. And in this case, what in a bit questions the strategy that what Russia needs is a pragmatic exit from Donbass. It's actual escalation in the Azov Sea with Kerch Bridge, with blocking exports from Mariupol and Berdyansk, and the latest escalation in November. So if Russia is really looking for a pragmatic solution, what would that actually mean, and how do such escalations can actually build any minimal trust between the parties to even think about pragmatic solutions? And the last, about the Eurasian Economic Union, this is also the contention point, because actually the current strategy of Ukrainian government is keeping as far away of Eurasian Economic Union as possible and continuing this strategy that we lessen our share of trade with Russia and we invest as much in other directions as possible. So these strategies also go in different directions currently. So as if we compare these two strategies, they're still not too much compatible. And you can think on your own what are the perspectives in the nearest future.
Okay. Would you like to comment?
No,
Otherwise I would open the...
Let's open them.
Yeah, I think we're already quite...
Add just one point.
Just one point.
Just one point, okay.
And then we're risking again of giving NADIIA the word. Yes.
That's the problem. The strategies of Russia and Ukraine, as for now, are not comparable. If we are, for example, talking about the implementation of the Minsk agreements, what does it mean from the Russian point of view? From the Russian point of view, Minsk Protocol and the Minsk Agreement are kind of a roadmap. And Kiev should implement it point by point, just as it's listed.
And which points are the first?
The first are the Minsk Protocol points.
The first are about
the ceasefire, of course.
And this is where all the process stumbled and is dead from 2016.
All right. But as I understand from the Ukrainian point of view, these agreements, there are just two parts of it. There's the political part and there's the security part. And the security part is far more important from the Ukrainian point of view than from the Russian point of view. You're absolutely right. So we are not moving any further from this point, and because of that we should think about first strengthening the OSCE mission in Ukraine, in Donbass, and second, maybe in some way just inviting the UN forces into Donbass.
This is
That's
a question
a kind of catalysator
without any
for the
success.
solution of this. But still, there are internal and external factors for this Donbass problem. The internal factors we should not forget, and the most important internal factor are the parliamentary elections for 2019.
And presidential too, because we just started with
this. Fall 2019.
All right. Dear guests, please feel free to ask your questions. Please introduce yourself and maybe point at the panelist who is most likely to answer to your question. Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm
Mr. Krochenberg.
from the Institute of the Danube region in Central Europe. I just wonder about the Ukrainian economic situation. Of course, oligarchs are extremely important, but aren't there also a lot of small, medium-sized industries now popping up, especially in IT and some other fields? So I don't think one can only say it all depends on oligarchs. Maybe a question to Mr. Leitner. And the Donbass area is cut off or it's paralyzed, and more recently through the aggressive act, one really has to say, with the Kerch development and cutting off Mariupol more or less. So it's always squeezing, you know. One has to find new channels. In agriculture, it doesn't work that bad. But if I understand correctly, there are important exports now all the way to China, all sorts of countries. So there is diversification. But in the old industries, it's difficult anyhow because there's so much cut off. So I just wonder if there is not also a light at the end of the tunnel for shifting to other industries.
SMEs and
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. When you take a look, particularly into the western parts of Ukraine, this has become a very famous area for innovative information technology developments, and also in with connection to the visa liberalization, we immediately saw that, especially Poland and also to a certain degree Hungary, they started very quickly grasping the high talents from the area to their own industries, because there is not only in Austria but generally a huge shortage of information technology experts in, let's say, in Europe. When we take, and these are very positive signs into a direction of diversification of the industry, which has very long been one of the major criticisms towards Ukrainian economy, that there is a lack of diversification. It's mainly based on raw material, steel and oil gas transfer. Very positive signs. But when you take a look at the shares, it's still very small, but which doesn't mean it isn't growing. And however, also when coming back to oligarchs, let's see what happens if these business sectors starts booming, like how the oligarchs will try to either grasp it or let it grow, and how the shares will be divided then.
Mirjana?
I have a question for NADIIA. There is a personality that fascinates me, and that is Tymoschenko. I remember 2003, I read in The Economist about her oil deals. She has done everything, and has she ever been successful, and what can she offer from the point of view of the voters? What else she can offer? Any success story? Has she ever been successful? That's one question. And the other question is, and sorry, I'm not an expert at all on Ukraine. I remember in 2014, when Russian troops entered the Donbass, Christine Lagarde appeared on TV to say how much money was going to be given to Ukraine. She didn't seem convinced that that money would be well spent. I would like to ask what happened with that money. Thank you.
As to Tymoschenko, when she builds her campaign, she never mentions some of her successes, because it's really difficult to find some palpable successes on which to build. It's one problem. The second problem, the voter. If you ask voters what is important for your decision to vote, the past successes do not count. What is interesting for the vote is the vision of the future. And what Tymoschenko proposed, she proposes, like quoting Roosevelt, a New Deal for Ukraine, like a very socially oriented policy, again with high pensions, with salaries on the level of Poland in 5 years, and stuff like we will have everything very good, very nice country in 5 years. Just believe me and choose me for the president.
But she tried before.
She tried before, but still.
We'll try again.
She will try again. This is a very, very old politician in sense of as politician. She first became prime minister in the beginning of 2000. Still, she tries to present herself as a new alternative for Ukraine. As to all the IMF money, I don't know, probably you can tell better. There is one of the problems with the money, not only IMF money, but also some other money, because we have other loans. Some of them are not spent because of the low capacity. So there are some projects which are planned, which have money, but the state can't do that. Yes, we have this problem, but I don't have the percentage. Again, maybe you know better.
To be honest, I don't know exactly. Certainly there are rumors and everything, but I mean, when we take a look at some of the outcomes, at least the stabilization of the financial system with all the discontents to the population, which we must not forget. But at least, I mean, if we want to be very positive, this was one achievement which was, I guess, also supported through these contributions of the IMF. The percentage of, I don't have any numbers of like any percentages of the money which went into some dark channels. I don't know.
Much is going to the budget support. It's the budget of the Ukraine could not be run without IMF support. But much is going in that direction.
But certainly, I mean, the international donors, they are very cautious. I mean, just recently I talked to people from the EBRD, and they said, I mean, there is only a very low, there are only very few projects that you really support in Ukraine, because most of them are somehow connected to oligarchs who are on the blacklist of EBRD. So, yeah.
Right. But I think we must not forget in what difficult situation Ukraine was in 2014, and also what has changed since then. So yeah, just put things in perspective in a way. I think you were the next one, and then the gentleman. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a question concerning, because I was wondering if nobody was mentioning Nord Stream 2, and this was a very, very big question last year. So actually my question is very short. Is it a political or an economic project? Because I remember last year being in Kiev, and Poroshenko and Avakov and like all the elites there have been super, super strong against this agreement, we know, and claiming it to be a solely political thing. So this would be one question probably to Nadia and also to you, Johannes. And then I have also a question to you when it comes to the human rights situation and also the freedom of speech. I mean, you've already mentioning a lot. But I also remember being there last year on a conference dealing with journalists and journalism, and it was very, very striking that how much the Russian propaganda has been a topic there. So how do you see the Russian propaganda situation within media and journalists within Ukraine?
Thank you.
Ukrainian position is very clear, as you have said. So this is mostly a political and security question for Ukraine, but not only, also for EU member states from Central Eastern Europe, former parts of the Soviet bloc, like for Poland, for Lithuania. This is a very political gas pipeline. And so both our country and our, let's say, friends in the EU are against it on this ground, because not only because of financial reasons, because you lose a very great share of payments once you lose the transit, but also because of security questions, because when you lose such an important strategic asset, so it invites for further aggressive steps. But yes, in a nutshell, in Ukraine, it's viewed mostly like political questions. Again, referring to the previous questions about Tymoschenko. Tymoschenko is actually very heavily criticized in Ukraine for her gas deals with Russia, which is believed that led us into this dismal situation with budget and stuff back in 2009. So she prefers not to mention that, and she concentrates on the bright future that lies ahead of us.
Concerning Nord Stream 2, I'm not an energy expert, but I mean, certainly this is a project that has various dimensions. So it has the security dimension, it has the geopolitical dimension, and it also has an economic dimension. If you ask Mr. Seele from OMV, he says this would guarantee cheap gas for Europe. That's his argument, because like he argues, yeah, I mean, you could circumvent transition fees by not having it transported through Ukraine and other countries. But I mean, on the other hand, also, I mean, Seele sees very well that the whole project also has a very huge political dimension, and this is why he is lobbying so intensively for it. But I personally cannot judge whether this would be also economically profitable or not. I'm not an expert in that. It's just
Well,
Some
I
other
think
viewpoints?
It depends on the view from the Western side or from the Russian side or from the Ukraine side, the different views. Of course, if you have a pipeline, it's always good not to have transit countries because then you have the direct relationship. And there was a situation when Ukraine, well, there was a quarrel about it, but also when Ukraine was helping to stop the flow, the through flow, because they thought they need the gas first. So it is ambivalent, but of course from the Russian side it's very strongly a political instrument in order to say we don't want to be dependent on our neighbor, and it could be, of course, come to a security level. I think OMV is a bit too strongly Russian-oriented, is my impression, and they are likely to sell things to Russia and endangering Austrians' independence. So that I would not, what Mr. Seele says, I would not underline. But overall, I think what should have been done, and this was my and other proposals already in the European Parliament at the time when there was the crisis, to have a European, an all-European, not only EU, all-European network, independent from political instruments of the one or the other country. Because Russia can close, Ukraine could close in saying we blackmail now, even the EU is not supporting us enough, we stop. So therefore I think the real wrong thing and the real disaster is that Europe as a whole has not an independent structure, pipeline structure, where countries, of course, can send the oil and gas through it, but make it independent from individual countries' particular interest to stop or to open the flow.
Mm-hmm.
That would be good. Of course, it's a political question. But if talking about Nord Stream 2, we should not forget about Turkish Stream. I think from the Ukrainian point of view, Turkish Stream is a far bigger problem, or should be a far bigger problem than Nord Stream 2. I just don't know why nobody discusses Turkish Stream, not only today, but actually nobody talks about this problem, Turkish Stream.
But less
from the Ukrainian point of view, I suppose it's a far bigger problem, it's a far bigger threat for Ukraine than Nord Stream 2. From the Russian point of view, of course, it's a political question, and but still, if we see these things from the European point of view, of course, it's about getting these important resources cheaper. It's about getting it more reliable. So, just always two sides of the question. It's not always about Ukraine. In the end of the day, it should be in the first row about the interests of the European Union. If talking
From the
about
European viewpoint, yeah.
Of course,
No, only
I'm talking
one
European.
sentence. I think there's an agreement with Ukraine that if Russia would stop or would make a problem, that they would deliver the Russian gas and to Ukraine, which could not be prevented by Russia, because sometimes there's an agreement that you cannot send the oil or gas to somebody else. But in this case, I think there's the principal agreement that the supply for Ukraine would be guaranteed. But it's not a question of the money.
That's why I mentioned it's only the EU countries, because Nord Stream is not only the question between isolated EU and Ukraine and Russia, it's also a big point of discussion within the EU.
Yeah,
So what's best for EU is also the discussion within the EU. And as to your question of Turkish Stream, just because the Nord Stream is taking much quicker, and there is more chance that the Turkish Stream, if it goes not only to Turkey but also from Turkey to Europe, it's much more likely that
Which go to Bulgaria.
or
And
to
from
Greece. It's
from
still not
Bulgaria or
decided.
Greece and
Yes,
from
but
there
it's still
to
not
Austria.
decided, and Nord Stream is already in process. The pipes are actually laid at the moment. So more chances that the Turkish Stream, or how it will be have its name when it's complete, will be more covered by European law, which is not such a threat, and less by some exceptions of it. So this is the problem. Why the Nord Stream 2 is more important.
All right. We have
Yes.
still your questions on the humanitarian issues, and then I have two more questions, and I think we have to close the panel then. Yes, please. Sorry.
About the propaganda. Ukraine faced the phenomenon of propaganda in 2014, and we haven't known what we need to do with that. But now we know. But now we knew, and we know, and we see. We have the opportunity to see how propaganda works in Donbass and in Crimea, So basically now I believe we have two ways for reaction on propaganda. So basically one from the point of view of the state, and another from the professionals community of journalists. When we speak about state reaction, so we can remember the ban of the websites, Russia website, which product the propaganda. Also, we can speak about this strong and even tough reaction for those who spread the propaganda in Ukraine and within the Ukraine, and both who visited the Ukrainian occupied territories via territory of the Russia Federation, not via the Ukraine. So I believe the state learned how they can react very tough for the propaganda inside the Ukraine. And when we talk about the professional community, the journalists, I believe that they struggled another issues, because of course we are answering for the Russia propaganda, produce our own propaganda sometimes. And this is a quite, I believe, tricky question, because all journalists are, the persons who have the personal citizenship and their position. And sometimes this is conflict between the journalist as a professional who need to be objective, and the personal who are the patriot, who love his or her country, and who are against the Russian aggression. So basically, I believe in this situation, the community, the professional community of journalists, and they rely on their self-regulations, because we have this council for such situation when the journalists violate the journalist standards. But still we have this issue, of course, and this is a very big threat, as on my opinion, to the freedom of speech and for journalists' role in the conflict. When the journalist became the actor of the war, and in Ukraine, of course, we have such journalists who are the actor of the war, who are use the weapon of the war as propaganda. But I believe, and I still say that, I believe that this is the question of the time when the professional journalist community learn how they can deal with the issue by themselves without state regulation, because state regulation is always be tough.
Thank you. The gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Stefan Veresic. I'm from the Austrian National Bank. I just have two short questions to whoever would like to say something. One thing that hasn't been mentioned so far was the demographic situation in Ukraine. We have had the conflict in 2014. We have had refugees, internal refugees. Some refugees went to Russia. Some refugees went to the EU. Then we have labor. We have the free visa agreement with the EU. We have labor migration. I have recently read an article that there are about 2 million Ukrainians that work in Poland alone. And I would just like to know how you comment on that. And then somebody has you have spoken about the IT specialists of Ukraine that also work in the EU. Could that also perhaps be the danger of a brain drain, or Ukraine perhaps losing too much population? Because that, of course, you have remittances that are paid to Ukraine, but if people stay in the EU for too long and then want to migrate from Poland to Germany or further, or to Britain, of course Britain is a special case. But so that's one thing. And the other thing is shorter. The other question is shorter, that relates to something that hasn't been dealt with so far, but that has been in the media and all the time recently with many countries. That is the new Silk Road. China's billions of dollars of investments in many countries, starting with the neighbors of China, but also many other countries. And now China has come to Eastern Europe, and now Italy has even signed a memorandum of cooperation with China within the new Silk Road. And China says that the new Silk Road, China has about $1,000 billion at its disposal, if necessary, because it has $3,000 billion of currency reserves alone. So China says this is an open initiative. What is how do you see Ukraine perhaps being a bridge to China, from Europe to China? Or is something going on? Are there activities? Are there Silk Road activities?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry I have to interrupt you. We're really running out of time. Just very short replies from the panelists.
As to demographics, Ukraine is demographically on decline. This is the older population, the people migrating. Of all the things you have said, I can comment about the labor migration to Poland. I haven't heard the figure of 2 million, but it is believed that around 1.5 million people are working in Poland. But we did study, because I participate in Polish-Ukrainian dialogue group, and we did study a migration specialist. This is mostly circular migration. This is not people who migrated to Poland and stayed there. This is people who come, work 3 months, and return to Ukraine. Yes, so this is very important migration. It is possible because Poland has very permissive laws. You can arrive to Poland just on your biometric passport. You can find a job. You declare it at the certain office, and you are legalized as worker. Very simple. And this permitted many people to gain money very quickly, but still there are no signs that these people, they stay in Poland for a long time. This is quite an exceptional situation, but as you see, 1.5 million people, it's a huge amount of population, and it's now people from all over Ukraine, because traditionally it was Western Ukrainians who went to Poland, now everyone goes. It was very easy, a lot of recruitment centers all around Ukraine. And yes, they are using it, and Poland also sometimes uses it in policy. We are accepting Ukrainian refugees, so we won't accept Syrian refugees. You probably know this. And the second, I forgot. Okay.
The Silk Road? Does it play a role in Ukraine?
Silk Road, it was funny because Yanukovych in his last month had some hopes for the Silk Road. He wanted to build a deep water port in Crimea and also some agreements with China. His last visit in December 2013 was to China. They wanted to sign something. And since then it stumbled with China. So now Ukraine is not a principal partner of China in this Belt and Road initiative. It should be started from scratch. as to me.
There was always a good relationship, especially exports from cereals and so on to China. So there was always a good relationship. But I think for the moment China is looking, as you said, for countries with ports, for organizing import and export, and of course the big flourishing market. So it will come, but I think it's not the main concern for China, it's not Ukraine.
But according to World Bank data, China is the third biggest trade partner of Ukraine.
Yeah,
Trade partner, but in goods.
Before,
traditional.
it's okay. It's perfectly okay. But before, we were talking about Ukraine becoming a kind of bridge from China to Europe. But as far as I'm informed, there's no land border between China and Ukraine. At least not for the next year, I suppose. But so before becoming a bridge between China and the EU, Ukraine should probably think about becoming a bridge between the Eurasian Economic Union, Russia, and the European Union. So I do really believe that after the presidential elections, after the parliamentary elections, the current strategy of the Ukrainian government of a total break with the Russian Federation will change. It will definitely change towards a more pragmatic economic partnership.
Well, see, you were the last one.
Say that my question has been answered.
Your question has been answered. That's great. All right.
Participant.
We're very happy that you're here. No, just joking. Well, it's very late already. We've been talking for more than 2 hours. I'd like to thank all the participants here for their very insightful comments and remarks. I'd like to thank you that you stayed with us until the end. Mr. MARCHL informed me that there will be wine and snacks waiting outside. And I think the only thing we can do now is wait until Sunday and see how this election goes. I hope it will be fair and transparent and without any manipulations. That's what we really hope. Good evening to you and thanks for coming.
Thank you.